Let's look at what the DNS is. So most of you might know what a DNS stands for. So the DNS is basically the domain name system. It is a very important concept in networking and in how the internet is working all around. So let's try to understand what the DNS is actually. So let's imagine you hop onto your web browser and then type in www.openai.com. So this is basically the URL, and we also call this as the domain. It's a domain name, which is openai.com. Now the problem here is that when you press enter, your computer does not really understand what openai.com is or where openai.com is existing at. All the browser understands or all the machine understands is something called an IP address. The machine or your browser can only go to openai.com if it understands the IP address of the server, but not just understanding the domain name only. So this is where the DNS comes in. The DNS actually helps you to resolve a domain name into an IP address. Something like 13.107.237.59. So now the machine understands this IP address, so your browser can actually send a request to this particular IP, which is basically the server that consists of the openai.com website, and then shows it on the browser that you have. So you can think of the DNS as a very global, huge phone book of the internet. So you have a domain and you have its subsequent IP address as well. So you have lots of different entries here. OpenAI.com, which resolves to basically 107.237.59. You have Reddit, you have YouTube, so you have some IP address associated with them. So DNS is what actually makes communication on the internet proper, because it will resolve the particular URL or the domain name into an IP address. Now that you understand about the DNS, you need to know that there are servers called DNS servers which actually hold these information. But if you want to understand in depth what the DNS is, you need to understand that broadly we can categorize the DNS servers into four different parts of basically four different types. One kind of domain name server that we have is called a recursive name server. It is also known as a recursive resolver, or basically only called as a resolver. So there are many different names that this goes under, but it is basically called a recursive resolver or a recursive name server. So this is one type of the DNS server that we know. We have another type, and this is called the root name server, sometimes also called as the root server or the root DNS server. You have another type, which is basically the TLD name server. So TLD stands for top level domain. So that is another type of name server that we have as a DNS server. We also have the other one, which is called an authoritative name server. So overall, if you just want to understand the DNS is basically the service that's going to help you convert a domain into an IP address. But how do we actually get from the domain to the IP address? You need to understand how the DNS landscape is set up. So let's try to look at an example. So let's say we have your browser in which you did type openai.com. So you know that openai.com, the website or the web application that they have on this particular website, is hosted somewhere on a server in some remote part of the world. So this is, let's call this the OpenAI server, which basically hosts all the web pages in this server, which I need to bring it to my browser and then show those contents here. So for me to get from the browser to the server, there's a lot of steps that are involved in the middle. So first of all, when I type www.openai.com and press enter, a request is being sent to my ISP. So this ISP is, let's say, Dialog or Mobitel or SLT. So ideally, this is how a normal request would go. So ideally, the request is being sent from OpenAI, from your browser to the ISP, which is the first point where the request hits. So this particular part is basically your recursive resolver. So this is the recursive resolver server that you have, where the request that we are sending, the browser is asking the ISP, can you give me the IP address of www.openai.com? Now in some cases, your ISP might not really have the information for openai.com or the IP address that is associated with it. So what it says is, I do not have this information. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to send your request to somebody else to see whether they have that. Okay, so the first request that we are sending is basically from the browser to the recursive resolver to get me the IP of openai.com. The recursive resolver, if it does not have an entry for that particular domain, it will send a request to something called the root name server. So this is the second point of request. So from the recursive resolver, the resolver will contact a root name server and ask the root name server, do you have information for this particular domain name? The root name server, you have to understand, is globally there are only 13 root name servers all across the world. Okay, so these are the the top level name servers that does not really contain information about IP addresses or domains. But what they contain is, they contain the information of who you can instead contact to get the information that you were requesting for. So the root name server will tell you, I don't have the IP, nor do I have the capacity to tell you what this IP address is, but I will direct you to another server, which is basically your TLD or your top level domain name server. So the root name server will tell you, okay, it looks like the domain that you're trying to access is www.openai.com. So it will tell you, go and contact your TLD. He might have more information about what you're looking for. So there are many different TLD name servers. So there are different TLD name servers for the .com domain, for the .org domain, for the .lk domain. So all these top level domains have this sort of a name server for them. So based on the domain that you're trying to access, the root name server will tell you, I'll give you the information of who to contact. So the recursive resolver will then send an information to, or basically it sends a request to the TLD name server and asks, okay, can you give me information of this particular domain? Now the TLD name server is also not the name server that contains all the information, but like the root name server, the TLD name server also has information of who you can instead contact to get this information. So the TLD name server will then send a response back telling you who you need to contact now to get this information from. This will take us to the fourth type of our DNS server, which is basically a authoritative. Let me write it with a different color. This is the authoritative name server. Now this is the server that basically contains all your information regarding the particular domain. It will tell you what are the IP addresses associated with it. It will tell you what are the name servers or the IP addresses of those information. So all the particular information that is required for this particular domain is available on these authoritative name servers. Now imagine you are trying to set up a domain. You are trying to buy a domain from namecheap.com or from godaddy.com or whichever the website that gives you access to domain names. So whenever you buy a particular domain, all this information is stored in some kind of a name server. So that is what these authoritative name servers are, and now we know who to actually contact to get your information. So the recursive resolver will send a request to that particular authoritative name server, and the name server will now respond with all the details that you have requested. So now in the response, it will have the IP address of openai.com. Once this information is once the ISP receives this information, what the ISP instead does is, because this entire process is a little time consuming, right? But you wouldn't see it. Now that's the beauty of this whole DNS. Even though there are so many steps that are involved in this process, you will not be able to see that there is such a big delay. All of this is actually resolving in couple of seconds. But still, there is considerable amount of steps here, or considerable amount of processes that are involved here. So what the ISP does instead is, it will cache all the information that it has received from the authoritative name server. So what it does, it will take openai.com and it will attach the IP address information of it in its own cache. So next time when somebody sends a request for openai.com to the ISP or to the resolver, it only has to go through the cache and try to find out what is the IP address for that particular website. It will not have to do all these steps in order to get that information. So that is the beauty of the resolver. The resolver will actually cache the information of the different types of IP addresses or the IP addresses associated with different names. So you don't have to do all these particular steps. That is why the first time you try to visit a particular website, you would see that there is some delay. However, every other subsequent time, the delay is reduced. This is not only caching. The other thing is, it's not only caching in your ISP site, but it is also, your computer also has the ability to cache domains and IP addresses. So sometimes your computer can directly get these IP addresses from your cache rather than having to visit your ISP resolver. Alright, so now that the IP address information has been received from the authoritative name server to the ISP will now send the response to the browser that requested for it, and it will tell you what is the IP address of the particular domain. Now the browser understands, okay, all this while I did not understand what www.openai.com was, but now I understand that the IP address for openai.com is, what was the IP address? Let's imagine it is 13.107.237.59. So now that the computer understands this IP address, it can send a request directly to the OpenAI server, which is basically having this IP. Okay, so there are several different servers on the world, right? There are different servers. There is a Facebook server, a Google server, many different servers. Each server has its own unique IP address. So since we have identified the IP address that we want, the machine can now make that request to the server, and the server will give you all the necessary information that you need to display on the browser. So this is basically how the DNS system works, and these are all the different DNS servers that are actually playing a role in trying to resolve your domain into an IP address. Now, some important information that I was talking to you about. The root name server has only 13 name servers in the world. But when I say there are only 13 name servers or 13 root name servers, it doesn't mean that there are only 13 physical servers. Of course, they have different physical, many different physical servers for each of these 13 servers all around the world for redundancy and other purposes. But you need to understand there are only 13 name servers, and these particular root servers, when I say name servers, I'm actually talking about root servers. So these particular 13 root servers are overlooked by an organization called ICANN. Okay, this authoritative name server is the name server where, now for example, if you try to register a domain for you, like for example www.kripajayakumar.com, if you want to buy such a domain, we need to store information about this particular domain and its associated IP address. So all those information will be stored in an authoritative name server. Now when it comes to the recursive resolver, generally we normally go through the ISP. Okay, so basically the ISP that you're connected to has its own resolver. But if you do not want to use your ISP's resolver, there are also other alternatives like Cloudflare or Google Public DNS or Open DNS. So there are different resolvers that are available. Cloudflare, supposedly is one of the fastest DNS resolvers in the world. So if you would like, you could actually connect to that instead of the ISP's resolver. So this is basically the overview of the DNS system. Thank you for listening.